100 years ago, the peace movement was strong in the United States. In fact, the peace movement was strong around much of the world because the world had just come out of the most horrendous war it had ever experienced. They called it the Great War. Today we call it World War I. 10 million soldiers died in that war. 7 million civilians. The war was so catastrophic and in many ways pointless that the world was determined to find a way not to go to war ever again. President Woodrow Wilson said, this is going to be the war to end all wars. So when the war ended, they came together and they created the League of Nations, where the diplomats of the world could come together, resolve conflict, and prevent wars from ever happening. In Britain, at St. Paul's Cathedral, the priest who was in charge there, he initiated what was called the Peace Pledge. He urged young men to sign a pledge that said that war is a crime against humanity. I therefore renounce war, and I am determined to remove all causes of war. 135,000 men sent in pledge cards signed with that promise. And yet, less than 21 years after the end of World War I, Hitler invaded Poland, and much of the world was back at war again. And this war, World War II, was far worse than World War I. 20 million soldiers died in that war, twice as many. 40 million civilians died, 6 times the previous war. Once again, the world was shattered by this experience, and again determined never to let this happen again. And so after that war was over, then they created the United Nations, a stronger organization than the League of Nations. And yet, the wars continued. So that by the end of the 20th century, during those 100 years, over 130 million people died in war. And then came 9/11. And our country initiated what it called a global war on terror. And we invaded Afghanistan, and we invaded Iraq, both of which turned out to be disastrous wars. And there have been wars in Africa, and there have been wars in the Middle East, and now Russia has invaded Ukraine. War is not glorious. War is nasty. It is vicious. It is dehumanizing. It is sickening. Even if the cause is just, even if the cause is noble, it deeply wounds those involved in it, those fighting it, those suffering it. Where do we go from here? Once again, we hope for a world without war. This is one of humanity's greatest dreams, is that somehow we can have a world without war. And this dream is found in the Bible. The Bible has this dream, this vision of a world without war. And Isaiah the prophet gives us these dramatic images of a world without war. One of his images is of all the nations, beating their swords into farming tools. And in our passage from this morning, Isaiah 11, he gives us a picture of wolves and lambs together, and leopards lying down with baby goats, and lions eating straw instead of devouring other animals, and vipers not biting. Now, these animals aren't animals. These animals represent nations. What Isaiah is talking about is big nations and little nations, powerful nations and weak nations, all living together in peace. But how is this supposed to happen? how does Isaiah think such a fantastic vision will ever happen? Well, Isaiah says, "They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." The earth will be full of the knowledge of God. Peace will come when everyone knows God. Not knows about God, but knows God. Knows God's grace, knows God's love, knows God's mercy, God's justice, God's goodness, God's compassion for everyone. To know God is to give ourselves over to that God, to live with that compassion. And if we all do this, if we all know this, war will be no more. But how does Isaiah think that's going to happen? How is everyone going to know the love of God? "A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." In other words, a new king is coming, a different kind of king. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. He will not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. In other words, this is a king who's going to focus on the needs of those with the least amount of power, those who are so often taken advantage of, the poor, the meek, the disadvantaged. And this is a king who's going to bring protection to them and alleviate their suffering and bring justice to them. In other words, this is a king who's going to be addressing those resentments, those injustices that are so often at the root cause of conflict and violence and war in our world. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. In other words, he's going to conquer his enemies, not with weapons, not with violence, but with what comes out of his mouth, with his word, speaking the truth, inspiring others, mobilizing the good. Jesus is this king. Jesus is the one who shows us this way of God, who embodies it all the way to the cross, who embodies self-giving love. This is the way of God. And if we know that God, if we know the God of self-giving love, may the world have peace. Now, I need to be honest. I don't think it's possible for there to be no violence in this world, in this life. Because as long as we have free will, free choice, there will always be some people who will choose not to know God, not to give themselves to God's compassionate love. There will always be some people who will choose to be selfish, who will choose to be violent. And if they have power, then they will use that selfishness to act out violently. And then there will be others who will choose to respond to that by countering that violence with violence. But that doesn't mean we give up on Isaiah's hope. That doesn't mean we relegate it to heaven some time after our death. Because Isaiah is talking about our world. He's talking about our earth. This is a hope for us. Now we trust that God will bring a new heaven and a new earth. That God will do what we cannot do. But in the meantime, that doesn't mean we sit on our hands. In the meantime, that does not mean that we ignore the vision of Isaiah, the hope of Isaiah. In the meantime, our job is to live into that hope. Our job is to live out that hope. And frankly, Christians, at least in this country, are utterly failing to do that. According to opinion polls, Christians in the United States support the use of war more than non-Christians do. Christians support the use of torture more than non-Christians do. Now that just shows you how far we have fallen from living into our hope. That shows how far we have fallen from knowing God. Now, we may not be able to eliminate violence in our lifetime in this world. We may not be able to stop all wars. But we can be peacemakers, and we can create peace. And we can lessen violence in this world, and we can make war happen less often. We can do that. Do you know, right now, in the Western Hemisphere of this planet, there are no wars going on. In the entire Western Hemisphere, there are no armies clashing against each other. It is possible to create structures and to address needs in such a way that war becomes the exception, not the rule. You know, people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, they've shown us the power of nonviolence, the power of collective peaceful action, the power of peaceful resistance, the power of love and reconciliation. We must never give up on loving our enemies, because God never gives up on loving our enemies. On that first Christmas Eve, 1914, the opposing armies were in a stalemate. 1,000 miles of trenches cutting through the middle of Europe. The generals kept ordering charges against each side's trenches. Waves after wave of soldiers rushed forward, only to be mowed down by machine guns. And so there was a no man's land filled with rotted corpses. But on Christmas Eve, 2014, as the British soldiers were huddling in their trenches, they heard a song coming from the German trench. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, alles schläft, einsam wacht. And the British soldiers responded, God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day. And then the British looked over their trenches and they saw the German trenches had all these little candles lit along the edge. And so some of the British soldiers made a big sign and they hoisted it up. It said, Merry Christmas. And then the two sides started shouting Christmas greetings to each other. And then one very brave German soldier got out of his trench holding a white cloth in one hand and a chocolate bar in the other. And he walked into no man's land. And then a British soldier came out of his trench and met him halfway, and they exchanged gifts. And then, defying orders, lots of other men came out of their trenches, both sides, and met in the middle, where they exchanged hats and buttons and schnapps and cigarettes and wine and cake. Somebody had a tin of beef, and they used it as a soccer ball. They were kicking it around. They played a little informal game of soccer. They gathered their dead in no man's land, and they had joint funeral services for them. And when dawn broke, and it was Christmas morning, for hundreds of miles along those trenches, there was hardly any fighting at all. Instead, 100,000 men came out of their trenches to give Christmas greetings to each other. Now, the generals hated this. The generals put out these orders that anybody found fraternizing with the enemy would be court-martialed and shot. But for days, they could not stop this Christmas truce. And they had to send in fresh troops and replace the troops at the front line in order to get the war going again. And then the generals decided, we got to make sure this never happens again. So they ordered every Christmas Eve and Christmas after that a bombardment of the other side's positions. But it did happen again in 1915. Not as extensive, just little pockets here and there, but it did happen again. And it happened again in 1916. Because you see, if you give people a chance, they will choose peace over war. If you give people a chance, they can see the humanity even in their enemies. And we must cultivate this. We must lean into this whenever possible. We must lean into Isaiah's hope whenever possible, so that the world is filled with knowing God as the waters cover the sea.